Please welcome Professor and Head of the Department of English and Philosophy, Colonel David Harper.
On behalf of the Superintendent, the Dean, the Department of English and Philosophy, and the West Point Humanities Center, welcome to this year's Zengerle Family Lecture in the Arts and Humanities. I'd like to express a special welcome to some honored guests, Ms. Sue Fulton, class of 1980 and Vice Chair of the United States Military Academy Board of Visitors. Her guest, Mary Tobin, class of 2003. Thank you for joining us. I'm also delighted to welcome members of the Zengerle family. Joe, class of 1964, and his wife, Linda. Through their generosity, each year, the Zengerle Family Lecture welcomes a leading figure in the arts or humanities in order to foster important conversations and to forward the goal of the humanities to counter insularity and challenge us to think more broadly, deeply, differently. This is vital. As future leaders, you cannot afford to ignore inconvenient facts or choose your own. And the nation cannot afford leaders who choose to remain oblivious to history. In 1963, James Baldwin published My Dungeon Shook, an open letter to my nephew on the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation. When Baldwin's letter was published, segregation was still legal in many states and would remain so until the Civil Rights Act of 1964 finally made it illegal. But Baldwin's letter is remarkable because it encourages his nephew to see the work of integration more capaciously than as a matter of law. Instead, he claims integration will remain incomplete until all Americans, and especially white Americans, are freed from the ignorance and moral degradation caused by racism. Baldwin's conclusion to that letter is powerful enough that I want to read it to you. He tells his nephew that, quote, if the word integration means anything, this is what it means, that we, with love, shall force our brothers to see themselves as they are, to cease fleeing from reality and begin to change it. Baldwin closes with a sobering statement that, quote, you know and I know that the country is celebrating 100 years of freedom 100 years too soon. We cannot be free until they are free. If Baldwin's calculation is correct, we are still at least 46 years too early to celebrate freedom and equality in this nation. Frankly, one need only watch the news, one need only glimpse the dark extent of the carceral state, and one need only listen attentively to what passes for civic discourse these days to know that Baldwin was correct, that the time is still early, the work is not done. I invoke James Baldwin because our guest today is carrying on his work in a real way. No less an authority than Toni Morrison has said that Ta-Nehisi Coates fills the intellectual void left by Baldwin. Ta-Nehisi is a national correspondent at the Atlantic magazine. He's the author of the memoir, The Beautiful Struggle, and most recently, Between the World and Me, which debuted at #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. His Atlantic cover story, The Case for Reparations, was awarded the George Polk Award for Commentary. In 2015, he was named a MacArthur Fellow. I do not hesitate to call him one of the most important public intellectuals of our day. Between the World and Me, a National Book Award winner, is written as an open letter from Ta-Nehisi to his son. Intensely personal and sincere, it is unflinching in its appraisal of what it means to be Black in America today, claiming that much of America has been content to flee reality and take refuge in what he calls the dream. One of the most powerful moments in the book is that in which Ta-Nehisi tells his son how he read his way towards understanding in the Howard University Library. In the archives and special collections, Ta-Nehisi grappled with the realities of history he found in those books, and he grew as he grappled. We are grateful for that, for he has produced one of the most powerful books of our generation. And today he will talk to us, as he has elsewhere, about the imperative for America to grapple with its legacy of slavery, discrimination, and racism. Please join me in welcoming Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Wow, thank you guys. Thank you guys. When I think I received the invitation to come to speak at West Point, I guess about spring of 2016, I guess it would have been. I was abroad at the time in another country. And when you write a book, you have no way of anticipating how it's going to be received. Most writers don't prepare for success, they prepare for failure. Because the vast majority of people and the vast majority of writing done by writers is not read by anyone at all. And so when I had the task of writing Between the World and Me, my whole focus was on it actually becoming a book, it actually, getting to maturity. And I drove myself crazy, drove my wife crazy, drove my kid crazy. People always ask me what was my son's reaction to the book. And I always tell them, my son was just happy the book was out, so he could stop hearing about it. But I got the invitation at West Point. At that point, I had gotten to a space in my life where I was so tired of talking. I just wanted to go in a room and just be by myself and, just be in the dark for a little while. And I have an assistant who helps me out with this, and I was, everything was no. And I got this invitation. And she looked at me and said, no. And I said, I said in a note, no. And I said, no, yes. I have to go here. I have to come here. And the reason why I have to come here is because I can't think of a more important place to be for the things that I've discussed, for the things I've spent basically since my childhood pursuing the kind of questions I've been looking into. I write about the force of racism and the force of white supremacy in American history. And I make the argument that that force is greatly underestimated, and I'll try to detail that in a minute. But in a broader sense, I write about societies and how power moves through societies and the lies that folks tell each other and the mythologies that we enroll ourselves in so that society can continue to function as it was intended. Most citizens do this. It's a very, very normal thing. It's not anything particular about America. I write about it because I'm an American, so I focus on those lies that are most captivating to me, those myths that are most captivating me. But I spent a year abroad in France, and I know they do it in France. I've read enough of world history to know that there are very, very few societies, or none that I've come across yet, that are not somehow founded on some sense of mythology or some sense of benevolent or malevolent lying. But I don't think you guys can afford that luxury. You're different. And I can tell you were different when I saw you guys lining up before I went into the mess hall. You guys were impressive. And the whole time I was looking, I kept thinking about being a young man when I was 17 years old, how ill-fit I would have been to come here to be a part of West Point. When they say, and you've probably heard this before, but when they say, you guys are the best of us, the best of America, that's a thing that's like, it gets said so much, it's easy to, become a cliche. But I really felt it watching you guys. And when I had this, conversation with Colonel Harper in advance of my arrival, the thing I told him was that it was my feeling that those who are charged with defending the country have to know the country, above all. Above all. It's most important because we ask our armed forces, and I would actually include our police officers in this too, even though we're not here, but we ask our armed forces, we ask our various arms of the state that deploy violence in our name to go out and do that. And I think those who do it actually have the most responsibility to understand that deployment. I got on campus before I came over to the mess hall, and we were walking through a little memorial area. Forgive me that I don't remember the name of it, but I believe it was erected by the class in 1961. And it represented the reunion once again of North and South over the Civil War. Now, I'm a huge Civil War buff. I drive my family crazy sometimes. I used to, many years ago, when my son was a little bit younger, he's a little too old for this now, but I used to drag him into the car and get my wife into the car, and we would throw out, audio books on from my favorite historians, James McPherson or whoever. And we would go to Gettysburg, or we would go down to Petersburg, or we would go out to the wilderness. And folks just kind of got tired of me, but the Civil War, I felt it in a particular way. I felt called to it in a particular way. And so seeing that monument obviously was of tremendous importance to me. And yet, as was noted to me actually even before I looked to it, there was not much in the way of anything about the cause of the Civil War on that monument. And then I got to an area where I saw the Cadets code on display. And I wrote this down because I would mangle it if I were asked to repeat it just off the top of my head. And the code said, a cadet will not lie, cheat, steal, or tolerate those who do. And I thought, what if more of us could take that to heart? Now, I understand what that code means in terms of you guys and in terms of individuals. But what if we as citizens, as Americans, actually took that to heart? What if you guys actually took it to heart, not just for each other, but for the country as a whole? In other words, not just interrogating the kind of lies that you might see or the kind of deceptions you might see on an exam to a professor or to each other, that the country tells itself and that you tell each other. I was born under the weight of a lie. I was born in West Baltimore, raised in the 80s, early 90s, a time of massive violence in the inner cities of America. I know there's a lot of news about Chicago violence across the country and cities. Believe me, it is nothing like what it was during what they called the crack era of the 1980s. People were petrified. My parents were petrified. I was petrified. By the time I was 12 years old, I adopted a kind of code, a way of being, of walking through the streets on the way to school. I thought about how I cocked my hat. I thought about how I wore my jacket. I thought about whether I was going to have my book bag over one shoulder or whether it was going to be over two shoulders. I thought about who I walked to school with. I thought about where they were from. I thought about how many of them it was. When I got to school, I thought about whether I was going to go to lunch or whether I was going to hang out in the library. I thought about who was I going to sit with if I was going to be at lunch. When I got out of school, I thought about when I was going to leave, whether I was going to stay after school for coach class or whether I was going to try to hang around and find some other excuse to leave a little later. I thought about if I were leaving, which route I was going to take home. These were not innocent choices. These were choices designed to deal with my safety, to preserve my body from the threat of violence that was everywhere in the communities that I lived in. I always say it's normal for folks to go to school and, in school you're supposed to be thinking about school, but when I went to school, I was only halfway thinking about school. At least a third of my brain was obsessed with protecting myself. And I was young. I was an 11, 12-year-old boy. And I would come home, as I talk about In Between the Worlds, I would cut on the TV, and I would see all these sitcoms out in the world that they called America. And I would see Family Ties or Wonder Years. You guys are too young for this. You don't remember any of this. But I would see these, beautiful sitcoms, in these places with these beautiful houses and these beautiful lawns, and nobody seemed to be worried about violence. The boys worried about Boy Scouts. The girls worried about Girl Scouts, I guess, or whatever they were worried about. Worried about whether you were going to make the Little League, football team or baseball team. And, we thought about those things too. But above all, we thought about the protection of our body. And I had parents who were very, very well educated. They were not generally like the other parents that lived in my neighborhood. Both of my parents had gone to college. All of my brothers and sisters, there's 7 of us, are college graduates. I am the only one who is not a college graduate, standing for you right now. I'm the black sheep of the family. But I grew up in a very, very educated household, books everywhere. And I couldn't understand why we lived in the kind of neighborhood that we lived in. Why didn't we live in that other America? And so this became a pursuit of mine. I didn't know what the lie was at that time. I didn't know what the deception was at that time, but I had a feeling that something was off about this picture. Something about what I was being told or what I was being asked about the environment I lived in was off. And so for the next few years, as I went through school, being a terrible student as I was, went off to the university, remained a terrible student at the university, but the animating feature of my life was trying to understand the curtain, as Baldwin says, between the world and me, between the world I lived in, between the world that was advertised on TV. The origin of that lie is in that monument that I saw outside. When I would go and I would tour these Civil War battlefields, it would be very interesting because everybody wanted to talk about, the kind of interesting things that people want to talk about when you talk about war. They would talk about how Lee turned this person's flank or what defense Stonewall Jackson did here or what Grant did at Fort Donelson. And I was interested in that. I like hearing about hardtack and what it felt like to actually be in a hot wool uniform and stuff. I wanted to hear about all of that. And people would be very, very mournful because of the casualties. Back then when I first got into the Civil War, they were saying only 600,000 people died. And each year it's actually creeped up, and now we're at 750,000 people died. I believe somewhere on the order of 20% of the white male population in the South perished in the Civil War by the end of 1865. And you would hear these numbers, and folks would talk about that. But during the tours through the battlefields, nobody would talk about what kind of force it must be that would lead 750,000 people to kill each other. I'm assuming the cadet code is quite old. And I don't know, maybe I had that wrong, Colonel. I'm not sure about that. But I imagine that when Lee and Grant were hit, that it was there. And the question I had to ask, looking at that, is what lie was being allowed to pass there? What lie was being tolerated? That I would see the memory of a war where 750,000 people died, and you could not talk about the cause. The cause is the thing that haunts us today. I'm assuming I'm in a room of very, very intelligent people. We'll have a Q&A after this, so I'm happy to take on this debate if I have to, but I don't think I'm breaking any sort of taboos or saying anything remarkable here when I say the cause of that war was slavery. We know it was slavery because if you look at the declarations of secession at that time, the state said they were seceding because of slavery. It's in plain ink. Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, said slavery is the cornerstone of our new society. It was right there. But that doesn't tell the full story. What you have to understand is like the kind of force slavery was in a society. 1860. 4 million enslaved African Americans in this country, in the southern states. It's a lot of people. If you went to South Carolina in 1860, the majority of the people you took account, majority of the people there were enslaved. If you went to Mississippi in 1860, the majority of the people there were enslaved. If you went to Louisiana, Alabama, half the people, Georgia, half the people are enslaved. If you went to Virginia, where the majority, which had the largest number of enslaved people, you'd find whole counties with somewhere on the order of 70, 80, 90% of people living in that country were enslaved. In a democracy, in a place that is tolerating a lie. And if you took those 4 million enslaved African Americans Collectively, they were worth somewhere on the order of $3.5 billion. Today, somewhere around $75 billion. That's what it would come to when you mark it out for inflation. To give you some sense of what that means, what that meant within the economy of the society itself at that time. If you took all the nascent factories, all the banks, all the shipyards, the entire productive capacity of all of America itself in 1860, and you put it in one pile, the bodies of those 4 million enslaved black people were worth more than all of that put together. 60% of our exports, American exports, not Southern exports, American exports, 60% of our exports in 1860 were cotton. The great historian Eric Hobsbawm says, whoso says industrial revolution must say cotton. If you were going to find where the wealthiest of Americans lived in 1860, you would not go to New York City, would not go to Boston, would not go to Chicago. You would go to the Mississippi River Valley, because that's where the biggest planters actually lived. That was your largest concentration of millionaires in the country, in the South, in the Mississippi River Valley. You start dealing with those sort of economic forces, and then you begin to understand how a war could be fought in which 750,000 people died. And as we know with any sort of economic institutions have a way of becoming social institutions. So for instance, I always say the best way to understand enslavement in this country during the 250 years it was practiced is to think about home ownership today. Now, home ownership is the primary means of wealth building for most people. Most people have their wealth in their homes. If you were born of a certain class in a southern state before the Civil War, owning slaves and a little piece of land was how you built wealth. It was the way it happened. But home ownership isn't just an economic proposition in this society. I don't own a home, but I know some homeowners. And I know homeowners like to get together and talk about homeowning things. They like to talk about how they're going to put a new deck on. Or they like to talk about how the kid just moved out, they're going to turn that room into a study. All little, how the roof needs to be repaired. And this becomes a kind of bonding experience between homeowners. And homeowners have block associations, and they, comment on who's doing what, on what's what. It's a kind of social cohesion. The dream of home ownership, for instance, is very, very much entwined with the dream of being an American. You see that. Picket fence, home, separated, nice yard, 2 kids, etc. Home ownership is caught up in that. It's a big, big part of it. 1860, owning slaves was much the same way. Much how homeowners have magazines that they look at and shows they look at, this old house, or whatever. Like I said, I'm not a homeowner, I don't know, I just see it. Slaveholders had journals that they passed amongst each other, such as the Bowes Review. And in those journals, they talked about how to wring the maximum amount of labor out of a human body. That was part of it. It was a socializing force. When I give this talk from time to time, when I'm in the southern states, sometimes even when I'm in the northern states, I love engaged, so I always have a Q&A period. And someone says to me, well, Ta-Nehisi, that was excellent, but I'm from insert southern state here, or my family's from insert southern state here, and my great-great-great-great-grandfather lived there, and my great-great-great-great-grandfather fought in the Civil War for the Confederacy, but he didn't own any slaves, so how was he part of this? And I always tell them, your great-great-great-great-grandfather may not have owned slaves, but I assure you he wanted to. And he did not want to because he was a bad person. He wanted to because the system angles towards that, much like the system angles towards home ownership. You buy a home today, you get certain tax breaks. There are things that come with it. Years from now, there'll probably be some sort of environmental critique about why home ownership was ultimately a bad thing, maybe for society, but it is what it is today. And slaveholding was much the same way. It had a hold on people. It's a huge part of us. And that is how you come to understand how so many people ultimately died. We don't just know this from the data. We know this from some of our best Americans who actually came out and said it. John C. Calhoun, intellectual, senator from South Carolina, very, very interesting man. There was a period in this country's history where this country actually had come early on to actually regret the sin of slavery, and even those who owned slaves believed it was a sin that should pass out of existence. But as slavery actually became more profitable in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, there became a class of people who thought slavery was, as John C. Calhoun said, a positive good. But what he focused on when he talked about enslavement was what it did for the majority population in this country, how it allowed the forging of a broad aristocracy. And Calhoun said, with us, the two great divisions of society are not rich and poor, but black and white. And all the former, the poor as well as the rich, belong to the upper class and are treated as equals. John Henry Hammond, who would come on as a senator in South Carolina after Calhoun, said, in a slave country, every free man is an aristocrat. Be he rich or poor, if he does not possess a single slave, he has been born to all the natural advantages of the society in which he is placed, and all the honor lie open to him, inviting his genius and industry. That's slaveholding as a basis for membership towards an entire class. And what happened after the Civil War was fought? What happened after we decided that we weren't going to have slavery in this country? After so many folks who came here from West Point died. Did we stop? Did we say to formerly enslaved African Americans, go on about your way, be well? No, we didn't. We had 100 years of Jim Crow. We had a 100-year-long terror campaign. Terrorism is obviously a subject that's very, very important to you guys, to all of us. Domestic homegrown terrorism specifically, we hear a lot of talk about that today. Never forget that the most lethal domestic terrorism, homegrown domestic terrorism campaign was the 100 years of white supremacy that happened here, where the right to vote was abrogated through lynching, where the right to do ordinary, everyday things, to be human, to participate in your society, was abrogated through state violence. The line of plunder, the line of taking things, the line of stripping rights from African Americans is the most consistent line running from the foundation of this country to today, when you want to understand the relationship between African Americans and their broader country. I wrote a story some time ago. It was titled The Case for Reparations, and I went and I chronicled how this extended from slavery all the way up to some of the housing decisions made by the federal government in this country, and how you could see this line of African Americans repeatedly being denied access to the kind of wealth-building opportunities or citizenship opportunities that you saw all across this country. And I wrote the story, I had done it, went out to Chicago, done the reporting. My mother read the story, she called me up, and there was a big part of it that dealt with access to home loans and access to buying homes in general, and about how African Americans in generation just before mine had been denied that right. And my mother called me up, and she was very, very emotional, and she said, that whole process that you're talking about in there, redlining, that happened to your grandmother. It was right there. It was close to me. And I immediately understood that as not some sort of abstraction. That the legacy of slavery, that the legacy of all that taking, the legacy of all that violence was right there, written into our very policy, written into my blood. And it's written here at West Point. That's what I see when I walk through that monument. So I know you have this responsibility, great, great responsibility. While you're here to not cheat, to not lie, to not tolerate those who do, and to not steal. Don't forget steal. But I want you always to think beyond the individual. Think about the country you're charged to defend. Think about the country that invests so much in you. Think about the institution that you love here. And it's a great institution. I'm gonna tell you, I couldn't have made it here, man. I could just look at y'all. I know I couldn't have made it here when I was y'all age. Think about that. And if you're going to be intolerant about the deceptions amongst each other, there's nothing wrong with being equally intolerant about the deceptions that people ask you to submit to. Thank you so much. I want to make sure I leave some time for questions so I can interact with you guys. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, at this time we will now begin the Q&A portion of our lecture. Please clearly mention your name before posing your question to Mr. Coates.
Sir, thank you so much for coming. I really enjoyed your speech. So in class we were discussing your book, Between the World and Me, specifically your experiences observing 9/11, and we came across a quote that seemed contentious, and so I was just wondering if you could explain it to me, and I'm going to read the quote so everyone kind of knows what I'm talking about. So on page 87 you said, "I could see no difference between the officer who killed Prince Jones and the police who died, or the firefighters who died. They were not human to me, black, white, or whatever. They were menaces of nature." Thank you very much, sir.
Sure. Prince Jones was a gentleman I met at Howard University, which obviously occupies a big part of Between the World and Me. I don't know how many of you guys actually, I'm not going to presume that you read the book. Like I said, when you're an author, you presume nobody reads the book, so I'm not definitely going to come and presume you guys read the book. He was a gentleman who I had met at Howard University. Beautiful, 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 beautiful human being. Smart, intelligent. He was a product of a mother who was born into a sharecropping family in Opelousas, Louisiana, and had raised herself up, gone to LSU, went into the Air Force and become a radiologist, had literally pulled herself from the lowest classes of America and up into the upper echelons of America. And her pride and joy was her son, also her daughter too, but because I'm focusing on her son, Prince Jones, who was this beautiful, intelligent human being who I came across at Howard University. Prince was killed in 2000. I believe it was September 2000. My own son was a month old at the time. He was on his way to visit his fiancée and his then, I guess, year-old daughter. I think she was about a year old at that time. The officer who killed Prince Jones was supposed to be working on narcotics duty, and so he was dressed in undercover attire. He'd been enrolled into another affair, and he was looking for someone else who had done some sort of other crime, but had not bothered to change his attire. He saw Prince in his mother's Jeep. As you can tell, these emotions are not completely gone for me. He saw Prince in his mother's Jeep. He ran the plates. The Jeep came up for his mother, who lived in Philadelphia at that point. This was not enough for him. He and another officer followed Prince Jones from the suburbs of Maryland through Washington, D.C., out into Virginia, and shot and killed Prince Jones. This was before the era of Black Lives Matter. There were no videos or anything like that. We don't really know what happened. But I watched over the next few months as the state of Virginia investigated not the officer, but investigated my friend Prince Jones. They were sure he had to be a drug dealer or something. They looked at every angle, interviewed all of his friends, looked at every aspect of his life. The officer was not only not charged, he wasn't even disciplined publicly at all. Nothing happened. He went right back to work. This was in the middle of the time where the police department he worked for had countless cases against him. You have to understand what that does to you. How that makes you feel about your country and your relationship to your country. Because the police are the representatives of your country, and they're charged with the most harrowing responsibility possible. That is, they have the ability to take your life and continue on. I understand we need police officers to do that. We need police. We're going to have a law-abiding society, but when there's absolutely no accountability. And that's built on all the other decades of no accountability when you're black in this country. And it's built on all the times that at that point in my life I had been stopped myself, had not ended up shot or assaulted, but had been stopped for reasons that I knew not to be legitimate. No, I had no sympathy at all for anybody at that point, because I felt so strong that the country had no sympathy for my friend Prince Jones, who was dead in the ground. No sympathy at all for his daughter, who was going to grow up without a father. I didn't have it. Time passes, and you grow, you get a little wise, you understand your anger is not good for anybody. You understand that your inability to perceive people as human beings represents the fact that you yourself have somehow been stripped of something. Then in allowing Prince to die that way, and the legacy only to be the anger, which I admit I still feel today, only to be the anger, and my ability to dehumanize other people, that if I allow that, I've somehow lost something. So I don't feel that same way today. I definitely don't. But Between the World and Me is a work of literature, and its job is more than anything to capture the feeling. And I felt that way at that time. I was cold, man. I was absolutely cold. And I think any other human being exchanging places in that situation might have felt the same way.
Sir, Alex Weatherhead, Company D2. In Between the World and Me, you talked about one of the keys to your development was that when you asked your father a question, he didn't give you a straight answer, but he gave you a book to read. So I don't have a straight question for you, but I want to know what we read next. I know you don't assume that we've read this, but if we have, what do we read next?
Do you guys have to, and I'm just going to go on my little nerd phase right here. Do you guys have to read Ulysses Grant's memoirs? Did they make you guys read that? You should read Grant's memoir. It's an incredible, as far as I'm concerned, it's the greatest presidential memoir ever written. It is an incredible literary achievement. It holds a great place in my heart because I was not the greatest student in the world, and nobody thought I was going to be any kind of writer outside of maybe my household. And Grant came up that way in his life in general. He was not supposed to be the great man that he ended up being, and he certainly wasn't supposed to write a book like that. Nobody thought of Grant as any sort of literary anything. And the way he wrote that book, I think there's a portion, like maybe about 3/4 of the way through, where it literally says, at this point, President Grant found out that he had terminal cancer. And he just keeps writing. Well, the background of that was his family had gone broke, actually. And he knew he was going to die. But if he could finish this book, if he could get it out and it could do well, maybe his family would have the opportunity to recoup some of their wealth and live pretty well after he passed. He wrote that book, and I literally think like days later, he actually died. It is a tremendous fusion of the kind of work it takes to be a writer and just physical courage. And it's a beautiful book. All y'all should read. It's an incredible book. Huge influence over my style of writing, by the way.
Sir, I was wondering, when reading this, I'm sure that I'm not the only one, but when reading, Between the World and Me and the case for reparations, a lot of what you said came across as surprising. And one of the things,
what? I didn't hear that.
as surprising.
Okay, yeah.
And it has struck me how much of an information gap that you see about how we as society, you see society as perpetuating the lie. How you see, how Baldwin wrote a lot on this half a century ago and not much has happened since. And about how a bill as simple as H.R. 40 just can never go anywhere. I was wondering, from your perspective, especially after having published a case for reparations, how much of a difference have you seen starting to be made, if any?
It's being talked about. You're asking the question here. I think that's a great thing, to be at West Point discussing it. I was at Harvard a month ago, and I don't mention that to name check Harvard. I mentioned that to say that many of the elite universities, quote unquote elite and Ivy League universities in this country, because of the point at which they were founded, virtually all of them have roots in slavery. The law school at Harvard, for instance, was basically underwritten by a man by the name of Isaac Rowe, who was a huge slaveholder in Barbados. Georgetown, some of the guys that actually owned slaves, some of the clergy that actually owned slaves in Maryland, helped found Georgetown. This is a normal story. You know, up until a couple years ago, at a place like Yale, you know, you would see a rendering of John C. Calhoun, literally with slaves in the rendering, and black students are walking past that all the time. I say that to say that, you know, colleges and universities founded in this sort of thing are coming to having to reconcile themselves to it. And they're admitting it, yes, this was a huge part of our identity. Yes, this made us possible. But you ask about reparations and things get a little skittish. And these are some of the most quote-unquote enlightened environments you could ever be in. And so I think we got a long, long way to go. But honestly, for me, the deeper question is not even about reparations. I mean, this is something that I haven't had the opportunity to pursue this up like I want to. The real question is, well, what are the limits of a human society? Has there ever been a human society that willfully, without being forced to, or without something else having happened, actually apologized and made itself accountable for that? And I have not come across a single example of that. People often talk about Nazi Germany, but you know, I make the case, I think Germany killed 90% of the Jews living there at the time, so you don't really have a political force that's there, and they lost a war. So it's a different, you know, a sort of situation, not a civil war, by the way. Lost an actual war. But what you require, what you hope to see, you know, in a country like America, is not to have some sort of violent exterior force us, you know, to a situation where we say, you know, we can't afford this anymore. We can't afford to lie on ourselves anymore. You hope that that can come about naturally and consciously. That would be a revolutionary thing, because I think what we might be bumping up against is the limits of human societies in general.
Sir, my name is Jack Lowe, come age 4. You talked a lot about the deceptions and the lies that our country was founded on. Can you talk a little bit about the deceptions that you see that remain in our societies today, and what we can do as people to stop or try to change them?
I don't want to get y'all in trouble. I really don't, because, you know, I mean, I didn't come here to do that. You know, I love you guys. I don't want to put anybody in any sort of difficult position at all. The first thing I would say is I think societies in general lie to themselves. I think all societies have founding myths. Again, I don't know that America is particularly unique in it. But if I were to pick one, I just go back to the thing I based my talk on, and that is the Civil War. I know we're getting better about that, but you have to understand, in a state like South Carolina, and maybe I'm gonna get you in trouble here, in a state like South Carolina, you had a situation in which you needed a literal terrorist attack to happen to get folks to lower a flag of white supremacy. That's what the flag is, by the way. Again, all you have to do is go and read the documents that South Carolina itself wrote when it left the Union. That's all you have to do. Just read what they were saying at the time, and it'll be incredibly clear what that flag was for. Now, I know people say all the time, well, you know, things change meaning and da-da-da-da-da and this and that. You know, the Nazi symbol is actually older than Nazi Germany. And if I walked around with a Nazi symbol and said, no, I don't mean Nazi Germany, people would look at me like I was crazy. As they should. As they should. But for some reason, we treat the Confederate flag, even to this day, different. And it takes somebody walking into a church and butchering innocent people for folks to lower that flag. And they don't necessarily lower the flag because they see the error of their ways or they see history in any sort of different way. They lower it because it's impolite. They don't lower it because of the lie that they're telling themselves, which is a very, very, very different process. So for you guys, you know, here at West Point, I go back to the talk that I based this on, man. I think the Civil War is because I think once you can grapple with the fact that 750,000 people died for enslavement, and once you can understand how central that is to this society, like a society would not exist without it, then you can be free of some stuff. We all have to go through this. I write about this in the book, man. When I went to Howard University, I had this vision of slavery as white people coming into Africa and kidnapping black people. And that's what I thought. That's how it was talked about. And then you get to the university and you find out it was black people selling other black people. That was hard to take. It was really, really hard to take. I had a lot, it was painful. I had a lot of thinking that I had to do around it. But once I got past it, once I got rid of it, I came out on the other side. It's not like I hated being black. It's not like I hated folks. I felt like I understood so much more about the world. And so to understand enslavement as the root of American society is not to understand America as particularly evil. It's to understand America as the work of human beings. Scratch any society and you'll find this. You really will. But as I said at the beginning, you guys specifically, can least afford the lie. Even if some large, hopefully shrinking portion of the populace continues to function under it. Yeah, okay.
We have time for one remaining question.
Good afternoon, sir. My name is John Lorenz. So after reading your article, The Case for Reparations, and listening to your talk today, I just wanted to ask you if you have, in your studies, noticed any trends in subjugation or supremacy that you would want us to know as future leaders so we can, try to avoid it in leadership at any scale, or anything that you would want to tell, the leaders of our country about subjugation and supremacy as a whole.
Yeah, I swear I'm trying not to get you in trouble. I'm working really hard here. I hope you appreciate that. One of the unfortunate things that's happening that I see, one of the trends that I think is definitely happening is, I believe on the census for the first time in history, there's going to be an Arab category for race. And one of the arguments I make in between the world and me is that race is the child of racism, not the father. So the idea, I think, that undergirds much of the dialogue around racism in this country is that there's a pure black race, a pure white race, a pure Latino race, a pure Asian race, and if we can only get these pure races to get along, everything will be okay. Anyone who's ever been to an African American family reunion knows that there is no purity in race. It's quite obvious. Just look at the people around you. I'm black here, standing before you here, West Point, happy to be black, proud to be black, etc. But I'm wise enough to know that if I were in Louisiana, say, 200 years ago, they might call me something different. I'm wise enough to know that if I were in Brazil right now, I think Brazil has 70 some odd different categories for race, they might call me something different. This is important. Because what you then be able to get to is that we actually have created this thing. This is a man-made thing. Why is it that all of a sudden, out of nowhere, we're suddenly going to have an Arab category for race? Did somebody discover some new Arab genes? Did something happen in the biological studies? Is this science? Or is there something happening in the broader society that leads people to feel that they need to be able to mark themselves to certain things so that they can mark the experiences actually happening to them? Whenever you see races being made, look for the shadow of racism. It's always there. It's always there. It's not like being an ethnic group. It's not like having a particular culture. When you see people talking about race, always look for the shadow of racism. And I argue that black people, in fact, I know black people are not unique in this. It's not like when Irish Americans came to this country, they were instantly regarded as white. That's not what happened. It's not like when Italian Americans came to this country, they were instantly regarded as white. It's not like Hitler thought the Jews were white. And so whenever you see people marking off those categories, you should be instantly scared. You should immediately start looking behind that right away. And it won't just be for black folks if that's true.